Welcome everybody to our third webinar. It's great to see so many people on the call. For any of you that are newcomers to our webinar series, I'm Jerry Friedman, grandma, mom, and co-chair of ECA, and that is in order of importance, I think. I would like now to introduce to you Nathaniel Stinnett. Nathaniel's the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that uses big data and behavioral science to identify non-voting environmentalists and then get them to vote. He's been dubbed the voting guru by Grist magazine and was named one of America's 50 environmental visionaries. He's a frequent expert speaker on cutting-edge campaign techniques at top universities and campaign management trainings. He's had a variety of senior leadership and campaign manager positions across the U.S. and in the Senate, congressional, state, and mayoral campaigns, and sits on the board of advisors for MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. Formerly, he was an attorney at the international law firm DLA Piper LLP, lives in Boston with his wife and 2 daughters. We are very, very honored to have Nathaniel speak with us tonight. And I can remind you that ECA has partnered with his project, the Environmental Voter Project, and we have our partnership, and ours is the Elders Vote Climate, which ties into his Environmental Voter Project. You can take that pledge on our website or on the Environmental Voter Project website and make your voice heard. So before Nathaniel begins, we're going to have a little bit of fun, and I'm going to ask a question which will pop up on your screen. And that question is, what percentage of registered voters who identify as environmentalists actually voted in the last midterm elections in 2014? What you need to do now is just click on what percentage you believe is of registered voters fit that criteria, and then you will find out the answer to that as Nathaniel rolls through his presentation. So right now, I would like to turn it over to Nathaniel, and also to tell you at the end of his presentation, we'll have some Q&A, so put your questions in the chat box. So please answer the polling question rather, and Nathaniel, it's over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Jen. Both of you have just been so helpful in getting this whole webinar up and running. And I also just want to very quickly thank Grady McGonigal in Massachusetts. I don't know if Grady's on the webinar, but over a year ago, he first reached out to me and other people at the Environmental Voter Project and introduced me to the work that all of you are doing at Elders Climate Action. And it's just been wonderful getting to know all of you through Grady, and I'm very grateful that he reached out to us. So I'm going to very briefly talk about our work at the Environmental Voter Project. And as Jerry mentioned, it's going to be about a 25-30-minute webinar, and we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A towards the end. So what I'm not going to do, and I hope you'll forgive me, is drill down in real detail about some of the tools we use. I could go on for a very, very long time about the predictive modeling we use to identify voters, or the behavioral science we use to change their habits. I'm only going to touch on that a little bit because I do want to respect your time, and I really want to figure out what you care most about during the Q&A. So please just bear with me if there's something that you think I am breezing over too quickly. Understand that it's probably by design, and I just want you to ask questions about it, and I want to see what you care most about. So,
oh, Nathaniel, if I could interrupt,
yeah.
You may want to make it, we can't see it in presentation mode at the moment.
Ah, thank you very, very much. Let me see if I can fix this. I'm glad you told me. Oh, great. Thank you for letting me know about that. All right. So the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that simply finds environmentalists who aren't voting and then tries to turn them into more consistent voters. So what we do not do is endorse candidates. What we do not do is lobby to try to promote certain policies. And what we do not do is even try to persuade people to care more about climate and the environment. And it's not because those three things I just mentioned aren't important. They're very important. But we focus on finding environmentalists who aren't voting and turning them into better voters for, I think, a very good reason that I'll be getting to shortly. First, I want to talk about a problem that we have in the environmental movement. And that is this. Why can't we consistently enact progressive environmental policy? Well, I'm not going to pretend that there's only one answer to this question. There are a bunch of answers to this question. But one really, really big reason is this. When you ask voters to prioritize the issues they care about most, whether you're talking about a city council election or president of the United States or anything in between, when you ask them to prioritize the issues they care about most, climate change and other environmental issues are almost always towards the bottom of that list. Almost always towards the bottom of that list. This poll that I have up here, as you'll see, it's from the 2016 presidential election. And we asked registered voters who were likely to vote what their number one priority was and their number two priority. And you'll see only 2%, only 1 out of every 50 listed it as their top priority. And then another 2% listed it as their second priority. And I can guarantee you there is nothing cherry-picked about this poll. You poll likely voters in a city council race in Boston or governor of Idaho or any election, and climate and the environment are going to be way down voters' list of priorities. And this has a huge impact on how policy is made. Because not only will this change the type of people who get elected, but if voters don't care about something, why on earth would we expect politicians to? You all know how often politicians poll. As we're all sitting here on this webinar, there are probably 100 polls in the field asking voters what issues they care about and what messages appeal to them. And if poll after poll after poll comes back looking like this, why on earth would any politician, liberal or conservative, spend their time and energy talking about climate and the environment? This is a big problem. My guess is that all of you, like I, were really, really disappointed and frustrated that climate change didn't come up once in any of the 3 presidential debates. This is why. You were all also probably frustrated that Donald Trump didn't mention climate change once in the State of the Union. But guess what? Joe Kennedy, who gave the Democratic response to the State of the Union, also didn't talk about climate change. And it's not because Joe Kennedy and Donald Trump are the same on this issue. Of course they're not. But no matter who you are, Democrat or Republican, you are not going to lead on climate change when it is way, way, way down the list of voter priorities. Politics, despite the very corrupting influence of money, is still a pretty efficient marketplace. If the marketplace doesn't want something, no one's going to supply it. And right now, voters aren't begging for climate leadership. So why on earth would any politician supply it? So this is a poll that frustrated me throughout my career in politics that Jerry mentioned. But it also led to me starting the Environmental Voter Project, because there's something really, really interesting hidden beneath the numbers in this poll. Campaigns only target likely voters. That's so important for you to realize. And don't worry, I realize I had a little non sequitur there. I'm going to get to the numbers beneath that poll. Don't worry, I'm going to get to that on the next slide. But first, I just want to say, it's really important to understand that campaigns only target likely voters. So when you think about that poll, those are the only people who campaigns care about. And that means they're only going to poll likely voters. And so, as I said before, this means that every politician knows by looking at polls like that, that voters don't prioritize climate and the environment. But guess what? You look a little deeper under polls like that, and you realize something extraordinary. The reason so few voters prioritize climate change is not because too few Americans do. Now, I'm going to say that again because it's a little confusing. The reason so few voters prioritize climate change is not because too few Americans do. There are actually tens of millions of Americans who deeply care about climate change and the environment. They care about it so much they list it as one of their top 2 priorities. So why aren't those people showing up in polls of likely voters? Because they're not voting. The Environmental Voter Project has done an enormous amount of research using public voter files, and we've realized that environmentalists are disproportionately awful voters. In fact, the last time we had a midterm election, so as everybody on this webinar knows, we're coming up on a big important midterm. The last time we had a midterm election, 15.78 million already registered voters who list climate or the environment as one of their top priorities stayed at home and never went to the polls. 15.78 million. And they're already registered. They just didn't bother going out the door on election day. Jerry or Jen, do you guys have the results of the poll?
Nathaniel, can you see that on your screen?
I can't. Can you?
Okay. I will read it to you.
Great.
8% of our members thought 10%.
Mm-hmm.
19% thought 20%. And 38% thought 30%. 27% thought 40%. And 8% thought 50%.
All right. Well, now for the big reveal. 21% of environmentalists who are already registered to vote showed up in the last midterm election. Only 21%. So for those 19% of you who guessed 20, you're the winners. And I'm not surprised that so many of you thought it was a higher number. I was shocked too. When I realized how few environmentalists were voting, it threw me for an enormous surprise. So much so that I ended up leaving my high-paying job and starting a nonprofit, which is pretty insane. But I realized that the environmental movement actually has an extraordinary opportunity here, because we spend so much time and energy trying to convince people to care more about climate change. And I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you this, but that is hard and it is expensive. And in this increasingly post-truth world we live in, I don't know how to convince anybody of anything. But if there are all of these people out there who are already convinced, who are already with us, they're already dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who don't just accept climate change, but view it as a high priority. If there's so many people like that out there who just aren't showing up on election day, well, that's a big opportunity. And what might seem frustrating at first, what at first might make you shake your heads and say, why the heck aren't these people voting, is actually a big, big opportunity for change. Because changing people's behavior is a hell of a lot easier than changing their minds. I'm not going to claim it's a walk in the park. Getting someone who isn't voting to start voting is not easy, but boy, is it easier than trying to turn a climate denier. And boy, is it easier than trying to get people who don't care that much about climate change to start caring about it. So this is the world we're living in as we're about 90 days from the next midterm election. Only 21% of us, of people who deeply care about climate change, showed up for the 2014 election. And to give you some context on that, overall turnout of registered voters in 2014 was 44%. So that means the average registered voter in the United States was twice as likely to vote as environmentalists were, 44% to 21%. The environmental movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. And I think it's so important to understand that at this moment in time, when I know all of you are considering what your electoral engagement will be. So, I just want to provide a little bit more context, and then I'm going to get into the two things that the Environmental Voter Project does, which is identifying environmentalists who don't vote and then getting them to vote. But first, I just want to provide a little bit more context on this environmental voter turnout problem that I've mentioned to you. We have a nice round number in the United States, about 200 million registered voters right now. But as I'm sure all of you are aware, if not painfully aware, it isn't like all of them show up every time there's an election. So last time there was a midterm in 2014, we had about 83 million people turn out to vote. Of those 83 million people who actually voted, our research tells us that only 4.2 million of them, only 4.2 million, so about 5% of them, were what we would call at the Environmental Voter Project super environmentalists. These are people who don't just care about climate or the environment, but list climate change or the environment as one of their top 2 priorities. So only 4.2 million of them turned out to vote. Let's fast forward 2 years to the 2016 presidential election. About 136, 137 million people turned out to vote. Now, environmentalists did a little bit better during a presidential election, but to be honest, it was still pretty bad. About 10.1 million super environmentalists turned out to vote. So 10.1 out of about 137 million. So we made up about 7%, 7.5% of overall turnout. Not much. Not much. That is not a powerful voting bloc. That is not enough to make people stand up, take notice, and talk about climate change, which clearly we need to get people to start doing. Now, guess what? Here's the really, really interesting part of this. There's another 10 million already registered environmentalists who live up near the top of that chart there. These are already registered to vote environmentalists who don't even turn up for presidential elections. They're registered to vote, they just don't walk out the door. And so you'll see literally half of all registered to vote environmentalists in this country never vote. Not even in presidential elections. So at the Environmental Voter Project, what we do in a visual description is we don't try to turn any of these blue squares green. There are a lot of great groups that already do that. Instead, all we're trying to do is identify those voters up there who deeply care about climate and the environment but aren't voting. Then we just try to change their behavior. We're just trying to push them into the electorate. And the reason we do that is some people would call it a cynical approach. I don't think it's that cynical. I think it's just arithmetic. Politicians go where the votes are. It's that simple. Politicians go where the votes are. If they don't go where the votes are, then they don't get to be politicians anymore. That's simply how elections work. And so we feel like no matter who we elect, they're not going to lead unless voters, not non-voters, voters care deeply about climate and the environment. And we think the most efficient way to make that happen is to find these people who are already with us but not voting and turn them into better voters. So that's what we do. That's what we do. Now, very, very quickly, how do we identify these people who are non-voting environmentalists? And then how do we turn them into better voters? The identification part, and this is going to be one of those things that I'm happy to go into more detail on during the Q&A session. What we do is we build what's called predictive models. The way that we do this is we will poll 15, sometimes 20,000 people per state. Enormous surveys. And all we're doing in these polls is asking people, hey, what's your number one most important political priority? And what's your number two most important political priority? And we get all of this data back, and then we start comparing it to the information that's on public voter files, which has every registered voter's age and street address and census tract and their gender. We have a pretty good idea of what their ethnicity is. We know what their party affiliation is. We have lots of information. And what we can do is we can start looking for patterns. We can say, oh, look, there are a whole bunch of middle-aged suburban men outside of Philadelphia and Atlanta who listed climate change as their number one priority. How interesting. Oh, and here's another group outside of Phoenix that had these indicators. And we look for all these hidden patterns and correlations. And we build a model off that state's voter file. We assign a score to every single person in that state voter file, telling us how likely they are to list climate and the environment as one of their top two priorities. Now, this is a very long and involved process, and I've skipped over a lot of the details. And as I said, I'm happy to get into it. But the long and short of it is, this is an enormously accurate process. This is how every presidential campaign identified voters, Trump and Clinton. This is how most of the sophisticated US Senate and gubernatorial campaigns are doing it right now. And it's enormously accurate. When we built this list of super environmentalists in each state where we're operating, our last step was to send the lists out to an outside polling company and say, hey, can you check our work? The worst score they ever got when polling all these people was that 89% of the respondents off the top of their heads listed climate and the environment as one of their top two priorities. That was the worst score we got. These are really, really precise lists built off voter files where we can identify who the super environmentalists are. And as many of you know, who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public information. And so when we identify these environmentalists and confirm that they're environmentalists by polling them again, we can also look at their voting histories. And in every single state that we're operating in, environmentalists have worse turnout rates than the average registered voter in that state. We've got a turnout problem. But the good news is with these tools, with these data analytics tools, we're now able to individually identify these super environmentalists, cut out the ones who are already good voters, and simply focus on the ones who aren't voting. So then comes the second step, mobilization. I'm not going to talk about the third step, habit reinforcement. That's about what we do after each election and follow up with people. Again, I'm happy to go into detail on that in the Q&A if you're interested. But I want to drill down a little bit on mobilization. Once we've identified these non-voting environmentalists, how do we get them to vote? Well, the media that we use are door-to-door canvassing, phone calls, direct mail, digital ads, and text messages. But I think more important than that is the messaging that we use. I'll cut right to the punchline here because I think it's really interesting and will probably be interesting for all of you. The Environmental Voter Project never talks about the environment. And it's not because I don't like talking about climate change. It's not because our field staff doesn't like talking about climate change. It's because it doesn't work. And I want to be clear about what I mean by that. Talking about climate change is a great way to persuade someone to care more about climate change. So I'm not saying that elders' climate action shouldn't talk about climate change. But if all you're doing is trying to get someone's rear end out the door on election day, It turns out that talking to them about the issues that they care about actually doesn't motivate them to vote. It doesn't. Instead, what we've realized, and it's not just us, a lot of other behavioral scientists have realized this, the messaging that is most effective at getting a non-voter to start voting is to use peer pressure and social pressure. And what I mean by that is some of the examples you'll see in that little box that says messaging. We get people to promise to vote, just like you do. That's one of the ways in that we're partnering with Elders Climate Action, is we have people sign a pledge to vote and always prioritize climate and the environment. And the reason it's so important to get people to sign that pledge is not just so we can remind them of the election right before it happens. No, the power in that pledge is that all of us, unless you're a sociopath, all of us want to be known as honest promise keepers. And so if you get someone to promise to vote, and then right before the election, you remind them of that promise and you say, hey, Jerry, I just wanted to remind you on August 8th, you made a promise that you would vote in this election, and the election's on Tuesday. And we know it's important to you to be an honest promise keeper, so this is your opportunity to follow through on your promise. It has an enormous impact. Simply getting people to promise to vote and then reminding them of that and getting them to follow through on that promise can increase turnout 4, 5, even 6%. And if you don't think 5 or 6% sounds like a lot, well, you can talk to some of my friends on the Clinton campaign and they will tell you 5 or 6% is everything in this business, everything. Another tool that we use is just plain old peer pressure. It's like we're in second or third grade. We write letters to people and we say, hey, Jen, did you know last time there was an election, 93 of your neighbors on Main Street turned out to vote? Yeah, peer pressure still works. If people think that all of their neighbors are voting, they are dramatically more likely to vote themselves. Finally, we will often compare people's voting histories to other people on the street. And I want to be clear, we don't out anybody. We don't tell people's neighbors what Joe's voting history is, but we'll send you a letter and we'll say, hey, Jerry, I wanted to remind you that whether you vote or not is public information. And comparing your turnout history to people on your street, we realize that you're only in the 27th percentile of all the neighbors on your street. We essentially give them a grade. We don't tell that grade to any of their neighbors, but we tell it to Jerry. We tell it to the environmentalists we're trying to turn into better voters. That can increase turnout as much as 7%. Because just like we realize that everybody wants to be good, honest promise keepers, we've realized another societal norm that's still very strong in this country. Even people who don't vote want to be seen as good voters. And that's really important to understand because most people think, oh, if you don't vote, you've probably given up on the system. But no, that's not the case. Our research has shown that even people who never vote, when they understand that people's voting histories are public information and all of their neighbors and people like them in their age group are voting more often than they do, they change their habits in a pretty dramatic fashion. So that's what we do with the Environmental Voter Project. We simply identify environmentalists who aren't voting, and we use a lot of data analytics tools to do that, and I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A. And then, once we know we've found the right people, well, at that point, we would talk about chocolate chip cookies if it got these people to vote. But what's really interesting is the messaging that works best is not talking about climate. It's not talking about the environment. It's using peer pressure. It's using social pressure. And as I finish this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about that, because it's very important for all of you as leaders in your community to internalize these two facts that I've set out there. One, it's that a lot of your colleagues, a lot of people who care about climate and the environment, who are around you, are not going to vote. They're not. But the best tool you have to turn them into a voter is peer pressure. Now, I'm not saying revert to third grade and treat them like crap. But what I am saying is the more you can let all of your colleagues and neighbors know that you are a voter, the more you can let them know that one of the ways that you express yourself as a grandparent or as an elder or as someone who cares about climate change is by voting, well, that's going to have an enormous impact on them. Because people look to you for their behavioral cues, just like you look to other people for their behavioral cues. And that's an enormously powerful thing to understand over the next 90 days. The more you can be loud and proud about the fact that you are voting because you're an environmentalist, because you care about climate change, well, you can have an enormous impact just by letting people know that. So, in closing, you can go onto our website and see some of the results that we've had. We're having a pretty dramatic impact in the states where we operate. And we think that in the 6 states where we're working, and I'll show in more detail what those states are on the next slide, but very quickly, they're Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Massachusetts, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. In those 6 states, we think we can add anywhere from 67,000 to 108,000 brand new environmental voters to the electorate this fall, simply by using these peer pressure and social pressure messages. And again, if you don't think that's a big number, think back to November 2016, where the presidential election was decided by a mere 77,000 votes. These are really, really big numbers. As I mentioned, we're active in these 6 states that you see. In these 6 states alone, we've identified 2.4 million super environmentalists who are already registered to vote, yet their voting histories tell us that they are very unlikely to vote this fall. And so those are the people we're going after. If you're an environmentalist who's a good voter, we don't talk to you. There are a lot of great groups that already talk to you and try to persuade you to vote for the right person and all that. We don't touch you. We only go after the people who are very unlikely to vote. And what we're doing is we have volunteers around the country, whether you're in one of these 6 states or not, who are canvassing, calling, and texting these people every single day. We're contacting about 25,000, 30,000 voters each day now. And we have about 1,600 volunteers around the country doing that. Come October and November, we'll also have some non-volunteer outreach to these voters. We'll be sending them mail and digital advertisements. So in closing, I just want to say, please, please, please don't let your one takeaway from this presentation be, oh man, this guy Nathaniel Stinnett told us that environmentalists don't vote, and like, this is the end of the world. I can't believe our people don't care. I give up. Like, no. By no means should that be your takeaway from this presentation. This is good news, guys. The fact that there are so many already persuaded super environmentalists out there who are registered to vote, but not just walking out their door on election day, that's a huge opportunity, a huge opportunity. This is the low-hanging fruit of the climate movement. This is the low-hanging fruit. So please view this as good news. View this as good news. What can you do? Well, the first thing you can do, and Jerry mentioned this, on your own website, eldersclimateaction.org, and then you'll see that weird little thing at the, after it, elders_vote_climate_2018, but you'll find it on the website. You, your friends, your neighbors, your children, your grandchildren, anybody can go there and pledge to be a consistent climate voter. And when they do that, we at the Environmental Voter Project will remind them of every single election they have. Not just this big one coming up in November, but if they have a library trustee election next February, we're going to email them. And if they want text messages, we'll send them text messages too. We'll send them reminders of that election. And we'll do it using a lot of these peer pressure tools that we mentioned. We'll say things like, hey, George, you promised that you'd be a consistent voter. Tuesday's your opportunity to follow through on that promise. We know that this language will get them to vote. Well, it will dramatically increase their likelihood of voting. I won't promise that they actually will vote, but many, many more of them will. The second thing you can do is volunteer. We would obviously love to have you volunteer for the Environmental Voter Project, but I also know that Elders Climate Action has an enormous number of volunteer opportunities. And guys, we're never going to get these next 90 days back, ever. I know I don't need to tell any of you how important the next 90 days are. And I would suggest to you that when you're watching election returns roll in on November 6th, you don't want to have any regrets. So please volunteer, whether it be for us, whether it be for Elders Climate Action, whether it be for someone else. This is a really important moment in time. And then finally, what I mentioned before, be loud and proud about being a voter. People need to understand that it is part of how you express yourself as a leader in your community and as someone who cares about climate change. Because in the environmental movement right now, we express ourselves in a lot of ways, a lot of difficult and impactful ways. We've changed how we eat. We've changed how we get around to work and to play. We have changed our purchasing habits. We've changed our electricity consumption habits. We spend hours each week recycling. We do a lot of hard things. But one thing that environmentalists don't do is vote. And so it's very, very important to remember that peer pressure works. Whether you're on Facebook or whether you're talking to your friends in the farmer's market or anything, make sure they know that you wouldn't be caught dead not voting this year. It is the highest form of environmental citizenship as far as you're concerned. And if you're loud and proud about that, you will change people's habits. You will. And finally, I'll finish by just saying this. When we get environmentalists to vote more often, and I use we in the largest possible sense, all of you, all of us, the entire environmental movement, not only will we be more likely to elect environmental candidates, but I suggest to you that politicians care so much about getting elected that simply by changing who votes, we will change the policy that's made. By which I mean, there's one thing you can depend on every politician to do, and that is try their damnedest to win. And so every politician is always going to poll likely voters to figure out how they can cobble together 51% of the vote. And the more of those voters who deeply care about climate change and the environment, well, we can change everything. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives. I suggest to you that if we all wake up tomorrow morning and the front page of the Washington Post said that likely voters in the upcoming midterms listed climate change as their number 3 priority, well, the whole world would change overnight. Politicians would be falling over themselves to try to lead on climate change because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. Nothing. We've seen how our major political parties have shifted on big issues over the last 3 years just to get elected. Politicians go where the votes are. It's that simple. And we in the environmental movement have this silent green majority that isn't showing up on election day. And so we need to start doing that. So I've tried to stay brief and leave a lot of time for Q&A. That's where I will finish. Actually, I'm going to finish on this last slide so you can just see the 3 things that I mentioned. I realized that I just breezed over a lot of the stuff that we do, and I would welcome all of your questions so I can try to go into more detail on the things that you care most about. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. That was amazing, and I'm certain quite a mind blower to most people who would presume and assume, certainly as I did before I heard you speak and saw the data, that it just was natural that I would assume that environmentalists vote. So we do have some questions. Let me pull them up.
Great.
Climate change affects every other issue on this list. How do we open people's minds to this fact?
So that is a great question. And first of all, let me just agree with the premise that underlies the question. Yes, climate change is the existential issue. It impacts every other political issue that people could possibly care about. And now let me give a very honest answer to that question. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to convince people that climate change does impact all of these other issues that people care about. And I'll be totally honest with you about that. That's why we at the Environmental Voter Project are essentially taking the easy way out. What we're saying is there are so many difficult communications problems that we have in the climate movement. It's so hard to get people who don't appreciate the importance of climate change to start appreciating it. And I freely admit, I don't have the silver bullet answer to that question. So instead, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we say, okay, let's find the people who don't need to be convinced. Let's just find them, find the people who don't need to be convinced, yet aren't voting, and get them to vote. And so whoever asked that question, it's an outstanding question. I wish I had the answer. And I freely admit the Environmental Voter Project is taking the easy way out. We don't know how to convince people to care more about climate change or convince people to understand the connection between climate change and other issues. So instead, we find the ones who care but aren't voting, and we turn them into better voters.
Thank you. So we've got some more questions. This is from Libby. Why do these registered environmentalist voters not vote? What is the cause, or what is the reason that they're not voting? They're registered and they don't go to the polls.
Great question, Libby. Outstanding question. I am going to give you a very nuanced and well-researched answer, but I can almost guarantee you that it's going to be kind of unsatisfying. And the reason is this: we don't know. We don't know why these environmentalists aren't voting. But I think you'll be interested in hearing why we don't know, because we've actually done a lot of research on this, and I think it's worthwhile for me to discuss this research. As any behavioral scientist will be able to tell you, it's really easy to set up an experiment that tells you how to get someone to take an action. So for instance, you set up an experiment that tells you if you give someone a $5 coupon, they'll buy a product, but if you give them a $2 coupon, they won't buy a product. That's an example of an experiment on how to get someone to take an action. What's really hard, though, is to set up an experiment that tells you why someone isn't taking an action, like voting. In fact, it's almost impossible to set up a really rigorous experiment. The only thing you can do is ask them. That's really the only thing you can do. And so we've done that. We polled hundreds, even thousands of environmentalists to try to figure out why they weren't voting. And we learned some amazing things. The first thing I'll tell you about is we did a poll where we polled, I think, about 500 or 600 environmentalists who are registered to vote and had been registered for at least 5 years, but had never voted once. And then we had another population of super environmentalists who never missed an election. They were super voters. And what we did was we asked each of these groups, the non-voters and the super voters, the same set of questions about the importance of civic engagement and voting and politics and politicians. And we found out two amazing things. The first thing we found out, Libby, was both groups answered every question exactly the same. So we asked the super voters do you think it's important to vote in every election? And of course, they said, yeah, it's really important. We asked the non-voters the same question, and they said, oh yeah, it's really important to vote in every election. We asked the non-voters, do you think politicians care about the issues that you care about? And they said, no, they don't care. We asked the super voters the same question, and they said, no, politicians don't care about the issues I care about. We asked the non-voters if they think that all politicians were the same. And they said, yeah, all politicians are the same. The super voters said, yeah, all politicians are the same. The non-voters said, my vote doesn't make a difference. The super voters said, my vote doesn't make a difference. It was really amazing. So we found a lot of the excuses that non-voters gave for not voting, but we're not convinced that those are actual causes of them not voting, because people who vote give the same reasons. They give the same excuses. This is kind of a black box. It's very hard to understand why these people aren't voting. But let me finish by getting to the second important thing that we learned from this study. The one question that we asked that was unique to just the non-voters was we asked them an open-ended question, which is kind of expensive in polling. But Libby, you asked a very important question, and it's one that we ask ourselves a lot. We asked these non-voters, when you don't vote, what are your reasons for not voting? Now, obviously, people gave a whole bunch of different reasons, and we put them into categories, and we tried to tally them up. But the one thing that we noticed that was absolutely extraordinary was that 74% of the respondents said, no, I always vote. Now, I want to remind you all, who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. It's public information. These people were lying their pants off. And we thought they might lie, so we actually had a backup question ready to go. And we said, okay, on the rare occasion that you don't vote, what are your reasons for not voting? We wanted to give them the freedom to admit why they don't vote. The number reduced a little bit. It was a slightly smaller majority, but still a majority. Still 51% said, no, you don't get it. I always vote. They lied their pants off. And so to answer your question, Libby, we don't know why these environmentalists aren't voting. And we've done a lot of research on it, and other people have too. And we probably will never know. It's a black box. But what we do know is this. We know how to get them to vote, which is ultimately far more important. And one of our most powerful tools for getting them to vote can be revealed in that lie that I just spoke about. Overwhelming majorities of people who never vote lie their pants off to pollsters and swear up and down that they vote every time there's an election. And that is a perfect example of why social pressure and peer pressure work. Because even people who don't vote still buy into the societal norm that voting's important. They still want everybody to think that they vote all the time, which is why I said it's so important for all of you to be loud and proud about why voting is important to you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. That was just every explanation is just mind-blowing to what we inherently believe in our hearts. Here's another question, and that is, why did you pick the states that you did? Can you just give an example of one of the states and why you picked it?
That's a great question. So we launched in Massachusetts 2.5 years ago for two reasons. One, it's where I live. And two, there were going to be a lot of elections during our first year where we were trying to prove our concept. And obviously the only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to have an election. So we wanted a lot of opportunities to prove that what we were doing could work. Now, why did we expand into the other 5 states? Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. The number one reason was that each of those 5 states have enormous numbers of non-voting environmentalists. And that's really important to us as an organization, because in order for us to have a big impact, we need to have a lot of targets. We need to have a big denominator of non-voting environmentalists. If we went into a place like Idaho, we could kill it every time there was an election, and it still wouldn't make a difference because there just aren't that many non-voting environmentalists in Idaho. But in those 5 states, we found enormous populations of non-voting environmentalists. And if you go to our website, you can look at our 2017 annual report, and you can see a map there that shows about 21 or 22 states where we've identified really large populations of non-voting environmentalists. And those are the states where we think we can have the biggest impact.
Great, thank you. So we're assuming you'll be able to move beyond your 6 states, moving into the 2020 election. Okay, another question. Would it bring more environmentalists out to vote if we can get a candidate or candidates to really discuss their views on climate change?
So that's a great question. I am, by nature of the work that I do, I try to bring a lot of scientific rigor to all of the studies that we do. And so I'll give you a quick answer and then a more nuanced answer. My quick, honest answer is, I don't know and no one knows. It's really hard to test. By definition, you can't run 5,000 candidates at the same time and see how people react to it. But what do I think? Yeah, I absolutely think that it would drive turnout if we had candidates who spoke more about climate change. Absolutely, absolutely. However, and I think this is so important to understand, it's not necessary. Would it be helpful? Yeah, but it is not necessary. We can dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who vote regardless of who runs. And I'm going to use an example to illustrate this. I know that there are people on this webinar from around the country, but I'll use myself as an example. I live in Massachusetts. In 2016, let me tell you what was on our ballot. Everybody knew that Hillary Clinton was going to get all of our electoral college votes. Everybody knew who was going to win each of our 9 congressional seats because no one was challenged. We have 50 state Senate seats and 150 state rep seats. Only 4 of those 200 races were close. And we had 4 statewide ballot initiatives, the closest of which was decided by 21%, 21 points. So there is nothing on our ballot that I could claim my vote would impact, or that anybody in their right mind would think their vote would impact. Yet 4 million people walked out their door on election day to vote. 4 million. And unless they were insane or living in a cave, not a single one of them were voting because they thought that their vote would have an impact on the outcome of that election. You would be crazy in Massachusetts if you thought your vote was going to have an impact. No, if we're honest with ourselves, the reason we were probably all voting wasn't because there was some transactional value in it, but rather because of who we are and who we want to be. We had probably decided at some point in our lives that it was important to be civically engaged, that it was important to be a voter. Or maybe we didn't want to admit to our spouse that we didn't vote. Or maybe we talked to all of our friends about politics all the time, and so it was important to vote. The act of voting was almost expressing an aspect of our personality. And I bring that up because it's not only very clear behavioral science behind a lot of these turnout messages that we use, but it also gets back to this question about, don't we need to have a climate candidate, or won't a climate candidate help turn people out? Yes, climate candidates will help drive turnout, but understand that most people walk out their door on election day not because they think their vote is going to elect candidate A or candidate B. They walk out the door on election day because of some societal pressure or some aspect of their personality that's made them decide, I'm going to take part in this. I am going to be a voter. And I think that's so important to understand. We can't wait for a savior. We can't wait for a Messiah. And we also can't think that we need that in order to change this environmental turnout problem, because we don't. We don't.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more quick question. And this is somebody who's saying, well, what about the states that you aren't working in? Is there something we can do in those states?
Absolutely. And that's a great, great question. So the first thing you can do is sign the Elders Climate Action Voter Pledge. Because even if you're not in one of those 6 states where the Environmental Voter Project is working, if you sign that pledge, or if you get your friends to sign that pledge, or your children or your grandchildren, the Environmental Voter Project will send those people reminders prior to every election, whether they are in one of our 6 states or not. We have a database of every single election, from library trustee and dog catcher elections up to president, in all 50 states plus the territories. And whenever anybody who signs that pledge has an election, we will do our damnedest to make sure that they get to the polls. So that's one thing that you can do. If you live in Montana and you want to get as many environmentalists as possible to vote, spread the word about this Elders Climate Action Voter Pledge, because if they sign that pledge, they'll be folded into EVP's turnout universe, and we will mobilize them, whether they're in one of our 6 states or not. The second thing that you can do is, even if you're not in one of our 6 states, if you want to mobilize people in those 6 states, go to our website and sign up to volunteer. We're already working with a lot of your members. We will train you over webinar. It's a very, very easy training process. And you'll be able to call or text voters from the comfort of your own home. You can sit there watching television and text these non-voting environmentalists we've identified in Florida and Nevada and Pennsylvania and some really, really important states. Now, obviously, you can only do that into the 6 states where we're active, but you can do that from wherever you live. We've got 300 volunteers in California who are texting people in Florida and Georgia for us. So those are 2 ways that you can really, really get involved using our tools. Get people to sign that pledge, and also volunteer to turn out voters in these 6 states. And because I know that this is the last question, I just want to finish by saying, guys, please, I mentioned this in my presentation, think about yourself 3 months from now. Think about your future self watching election returns roll in. Don't have any regrets. Don't have any regrets. Volunteer. Get people to sign this voter pledge. This is an existentially important moment in time for people who care about climate change. And we need to get involved. We need to. I hope that we'll be able to be involved together. The Environmental Voter Project loves working with all of you. Elders Climate Action is absolutely amazing. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity this evening, but also just the opportunity all throughout this year to be working with all of you. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. And I think we have our marching orders. We, can talk with our neighbors, our friends. And I can tell you from my perspective, my friends, all that are environmentalists, certainly all claim to vote. And now I wonder, do they really? And I think that's important for us to recognize and to really understand. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We too love working with you. I'm certain all our attendees had a wonderful evening. And we're going to now take a short break. We'll come back at 7:03. We'll come back at 7:08. Very quick break so you can stretch your legs, get a cup of tea, a glass of wine, and we'll come back and have another project that we're working on, and that is the Candidates Climate Pledge, asking candidates to pledge they're going to take climate action to get that conversation going. And you'll hear from 2 of our ECA people to do that part of the webinar. So thank you so much again. It's been wonderful. And we really, 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 really appreciate your time and your information. Just incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.